They say trust is the foundation of marriage, but I'll let you in on a darker truth. Sometimes the person you trust most is the one shaving her head in the bathroom, booking fake chemo appointments, and draining $30,000 a month from your accounts, all for a cancer that only exists on paper. This is the story of a wife, a forged oncologist's signature, and the father-in-law whose fraternity brother hadn't seen her once. Meet the husband who thought he was supporting his dying wife, and the father who realized the oncology paperwork was signed by his own old friend, who'd never treated her. $30,000 a month was vanishing. The wife was shaving her head, posting about chemo, drawing sympathy from an entire community, but it was all a performance. This is the inside account of how one man's gut feeling cracked open a fraud that stretched back years, leaving a family shattered and a question that still haunts them. How do you fake cancer to the people who love you most? The answer starts with a phone call. That phone call came on a Tuesday morning in early October, the kind of call that starts with a casual check-in and ends with your entire understanding of your life lying in pieces on the kitchen floor. The man on the receiving end was David Calloway, a 58-year-old retired contractor from suburban Chicago who had spent the last 30 years building custom homes for families he'd never see again. David wasn't a suspicious man by nature. He was the kind of guy who left his truck unlocked in the driveway, who believed people when they told him things, who thought the worst thing that could happen in a marriage was growing apart, not growing toward a lie so elaborate it required forged medical documents and a shaved head. His wife, Monica Calloway, was 52. They'd been married for 14 years, second marriage for both, the kind of midlife restart that friends called courageous and family called cautiously optimistic. Monica was striking, not in a conventional way, but in the way that fills a room before she even speaks. Dark hair, sharp cheekbones, a laugh that came easily and often. She'd worked as an office manager at a dental practice before the diagnosis, the kind of woman who remembered everyone's birthday and sent handwritten thank you cards for dinner parties. When David met her at a mutual friend's barbecue in 2009, she was wearing a yellow sundress and arguing passionately about whether the Chicago Bears had a shot at the playoffs that year. They lost in the first round, but David had already decided he was going to marry her. The first few years were good, better than good. They bought a modest 4-bedroom in Naperville, the kind of house with a wraparound porch and a backyard big enough for the grandchildren neither of them had yet, but both of them wanted. David continued his contracting work, slowing down only slightly as his knees began to protest the decades of kneeling on subflooring. Monica kept the books, managed the household, and maintained that particular brightness that David had fallen in love with. If you'd asked him in those early years to describe his wife in one word, he would have said warm, and he would have meant it with every fiber of his being. But here's the thing about warmth. It can be genuine, or it can be the heat of a stage light, and David Calloway was about to learn the difference in the most brutal way possible. The first sign came in the spring of 2020. Monica started complaining of fatigue, the kind that sleep couldn't fix. Then came the bruising, small dark marks on her arms and legs that she said appeared out of nowhere. Then the night sweats, the unexplained weight loss, the paleness that no amount of time in the garden could correct. David watched his vibrant wife dim by degrees, and he did what any loving husband would do. He insisted she see a doctor, multiple doctors in fact, specialists, hematologists, oncologists. The appointments multiplied and with them the paperwork. Now, I need to pause here and introduce a figure who will become increasingly important as this story unfolds. David's father-in-law, Monica's dad, was a man named Robert Keene. Robert was 74 years old, a retired corporate attorney who had spent 40 years in a Chicago firm that handled mergers and acquisitions for Fortune 500 companies. He was the kind of man who read contracts for pleasure, who could spot a logical inconsistency from across a dinner table, and who had built his entire career on the principle that if something looked wrong, it probably was. Robert loved his daughter. He also, in the quiet way of fathers who have seen too much of the world to be entirely comfortable with anyone who enters their child's life, had never fully warmed to David. Not because David was a bad man. David was a good man, and Robert knew that. But good men are easy to manipulate, and Robert Keene had spent 4 decades watching good men get destroyed by people who knew exactly which strings to pull. When Monica's diagnosis arrived, it hit the family like a freight train. Stage 3 non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, aggressive, requiring immediate treatment. The news came through an oncologist named Dr. Marcus Webb at Northwestern Memorial, a name that would later become the fulcrum on which the entire deception would pivot. Monica delivered the diagnosis herself, sitting at her parents' dining room table with a manila folder full of test results, her voice steady but her eyes wet. Robert held his daughter. David held his wife, and the family began the long, brutal process of preparing for war against an enemy they couldn't see. But Robert Keene noticed something that afternoon, something small, something he filed away and didn't mention to anyone, not even his own wife of 51 years. The signature on the pathology report, Dr. Marcus Webb. Neat, professional, unremarkable at first glance. Except Robert knew that signature. He'd seen it before, decades ago, on a fraternity paddle hanging in the basement of his old chapter house at the University of Michigan. Marcus Webb had been his pledge brother in 1969. They'd stayed in loose touch over the years, Christmas cards mostly, the occasional phone call when a mutual friend passed away. Robert hadn't spoken to Marcus directly in maybe 6 years, but he knew the man was still practicing, still at Northwestern, still one of the top oncologists in the Midwest. He didn't mention it at the dinner table because he didn't want to make the moment about himself. But on the drive home that night, Robert Keene sat in his car in the garage for an extra 10 minutes, engine off, staring at the wall. Something felt off, not the diagnosis itself. Cancer is random and brutal, and it doesn't care about your family history or your Christmas card list. No, what felt off was the fact that Monica hadn't mentioned the connection. She knew Marcus Webb was her father's old friend. She'd met him at a family reunion years ago. And yet she'd sat at that table and presented the doctor's name like it meant nothing to her. Robert told himself he was being paranoid. That maybe she'd forgotten. That maybe she was too overwhelmed by her own mortality to make the connection. He told himself a lot of things in the weeks that followed. But the thing about Robert Keene is that he'd spent 40 years not taking his own reassurances at face value. So he made a phone call. The treatment began almost immediately. Chemotherapy sessions twice a week. Monica's hair began to thin, and then one Saturday afternoon, she walked into the living room carrying a pair of electric clippers and asked David to shave her head. David wept while he did it. She held his hand and told him it was going to be okay. She posted a photo on social media that night, her newly bald head wrapped in a pale blue scarf, a brave smile on her face, and the caption read, "This disease doesn't get to take my spirit." The post received over 400 comments. Friends, family, coworkers, people Monica hadn't spoken to in years, all flooding her feed with prayers and heart emojis and offers to bring meals. What happened next is the part that makes this story different from every other cancer journey you've ever heard. Monica informed David that her specific type of lymphoma required specialized treatment protocols that weren't fully covered by their insurance. Out-of-network specialists, experimental drug regimens, holistic adjunct therapies that traditional oncologists didn't always endorse, but that her research, and she'd done extensive research, she said, showed significant promise. The costs were staggering, $30,000 a month, conservative estimate. David didn't hesitate. He liquidated a retirement account. He took out a home equity line. He told himself he would sell the truck, sell the house, sell everything they owned if it meant keeping his wife alive. And all the while, Monica documented the journey. Social media posts, a caring bridge journal, videos of her ringing the chemo bell at the treatment center, surrounded by nurses in scrubs, her smile radiant despite the exhaustion in her eyes. But those nurses didn't work there. That treatment center wasn't treating her, and the bell Monica was ringing had been staged in a rented medical office suite that she'd booked for 2 hours on a Saturday morning. Robert Keene's phone call to Marcus Webb happened on a Thursday evening, roughly 3 months into Monica's treatment. He caught his old friend just as he was leaving the clinic for the night. Marcus was warm, genuinely happy to hear from him, asked about the family, about Robert's wife, about retirement. They talked for 15 minutes, two old men catching up across the decades. And then Robert, almost as an afterthought, said, "Hey, Marcus, I want to thank you personally for taking such good care of my daughter. It means more than I can tell you." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Not a long pause, maybe 2 seconds. But Robert Keene had spent his career listening to pauses, and this one made his blood go cold. "Your daughter," Marcus said. "Robert, I haven't seen your daughter in 20 years. What are you talking about?" The silence that followed stretched across the phone line like a shadow falling over an entire room. Robert Keene sat in his study, the leather chair creaking beneath him, and felt the careful architecture of his understanding begin to splinter. He asked Marcus to repeat himself. Marcus did. He had never treated Monica Calloway. He had never signed a single document related to her care. The pathology reports, the treatment plans, the oncologist's notes, every piece of paper that had passed through Monica's hands with his signature on it, were fabrications. Robert hung up the phone. He sat in his study for a long time, staring at the wall of law books he'd spent decades earning the right to ignore in retirement. And then he did what any trained investigator would do. He started pulling threads, quietly, methodically, without telling David, without telling his wife, without telling anyone. Because if this was what he thought it was, the person he was about to expose wasn't a stranger. It was his own daughter. And everything that happened next would depend on how carefully he built the case before she knew she was being investigated. What Robert found over the following weeks would unravel not just a marriage, but an entire community's understanding of what one woman was capable of. The money was gone, the illness was a performance, and the man who loved her most was about to walk through a door he couldn't walk back through. Robert Keene didn't sleep that night. He sat in his study until 3 a.m, the phone still in his hand long after the call with Marcus Webb had ended, replaying every conversation he'd had with his daughter over the past 6 months. The diagnosis announcement, the treatment updates, the careful, detailed explanations of why her specific lymphoma required protocols that Northwestern couldn't provide. In hindsight, the details were the first red flag. Monica was too specific, too rehearsed. The kind of specificity that real patients, drowning in the chaos of a life-threatening illness, rarely possess. Real cancer patients ask questions. Monica gave presentations. The next morning, Robert drove to the address listed on Monica's latest treatment invoice. It was a medical office park in Schaumburg, 40 minutes from the city, the kind of generic professional complex where dentists, physical therapists, and cosmetic surgeons lease suites by the month. The address Monica had given David was Suite 204. Robert parked his sedan in the mostly empty lot and walked through the front entrance. Suite 204 was locked, the blinds drawn, the nameplate slot next to the door completely empty. Not the name of an oncologist, not the name of a treatment center, nothing. He pressed his face to the glass and saw a small reception area with a desk, a few chairs, and a potted plant that had died long enough ago to turn entirely brown. This was not an active medical practice. It was a rental space, and judging by the layer of dust on the reception desk, it hadn't seen a real patient in months. Robert took photos. He documented everything. Then he walked to the building manager's office on the ground floor, introduced himself as a concerned family member, and asked a few careful questions. The manager, a tired woman named Gladys who had seen every possible variation of human behavior walk through her doors, confirmed that Suite 204 was rented on a short-term basis, month to month. The current lessee was a woman named Monica Calloway. She'd been renting it for 6 months. She told Gladys she was launching a wellness consulting business. No employees, No clients that Gladys had ever seen. Just Monica, coming and going a few times a week, usually on Saturday mornings when the rest of the building was empty. The bell-ringing video, Robert realized, was filmed in that empty suite. The nurses in scrubs weren't nurses. They were people Monica had hired or friends she'd convinced to play a role, standing in a rented office with a bell she'd probably bought online. The thought made his stomach turn. He had watched that video at least a dozen times, tears streaming down his face, proud of his daughter's bravery, and none of it was real. But here's the thing about Robert Keene. He did not act on emotion. He was 74 years old and he had spent his entire professional life building cases that could survive cross-examination. So he did not call David. He did not confront Monica. He went home, sat down at his desk, and opened a new file folder on his computer. He labeled it simply MC Evidence, and he began to build. The next piece came from the financial records. David had been keeping a spreadsheet of Monica's medical expenses, a grim accounting of the family's sacrifice that he shared with Robert one weekend over coffee, thinking his father-in-law might offer some advice on managing the debt. Robert studied the spreadsheet with the careful attention of a man who had once uncovered a $16 million fraud hiding in a footnote. The payments were all going to the same place, a series of wire transfers to an account at a small regional bank in Indiana, labeled as medical expenses. But there was no provider name, no tax identification number, no insurance claim attached, just a routing number and an account number that Robert recognized as belonging to Monica's personal savings account, the one she'd opened years ago before they were married, the one she said she kept as a rainy day fund. David had been transferring $30,000 a month directly into his wife's secret account, and she had been spending it on exactly nothing related to cancer. Robert pulled 3 months of statements from his own accounts, from the accounts of a family trust he managed, and cross-referenced every transfer. The total was staggering, over $210,000 in 7 months, and that didn't include the cash withdrawals, the maxed-out credit cards, the $10,000 check David had written to a holistic medicine clinic in Arizona that turned out to be a website and a post office box. The money was gone. Some of it had been spent on what Robert could only describe as Monica's performance expenses. The rented office suite, the hired actors, the high-quality wigs she wore to simulate hair loss before she shaved her head, the professional-grade makeup she used to create bruises on her arms and dark circles under her eyes. But most of it had simply been moved, transferred out of the Indiana account to somewhere Robert couldn't yet trace, offshore maybe, or a cryptocurrency wallet. Monica was smart. Smarter than anyone had given her credit for. The medical documents themselves were the most damning evidence of all. Robert, using his old firm's resources and calling in a favor from a forensic document examiner he'd worked with years ago, obtained copies of the pathology reports and treatment plans that Monica had presented to the family. The examiner's report came back within a week. The documents were forgeries constructed from templates available on the dark web medical form generators that allowed users to input patient names, doctor names, hospital logos, and ICD-10 diagnostic codes. The signature of Dr. Marcus Webb had been traced from a genuine prescription that Monica had somehow obtained, probably from an old file at her dental office. The forgery was good enough to fool a layperson, but under magnification, the telltale signs were unmistakable. The slight hesitation, marks of a hand copying a signature rather than signing it naturally. The inconsistent pressure of a pen being guided slowly rather than flowing with muscle memory. The report also noted something that made Robert's blood run cold. The ICD-10 code on Monica's pathology report corresponded to a real and aggressive form of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, but Monica had chosen that code deliberately. She had researched which cancers were hardest to verify, which diagnoses required the most complex treatment protocols, and which symptoms were easiest to fake. She hadn't just lied about being sick. She had studied real cancer patients, real treatment journeys, real medical literature, and constructed a performance so detailed that even the doctors David spoke to on the phone, doctors Monica had arranged to call him using burner numbers and fake credentials, believed her story completely. She had been running what law enforcement would later describe as a full-scale confidence operation, and her own family was the mark. But the most disturbing discovery came when Robert finally accessed Monica's laptop. He got his opportunity one Sunday afternoon when David and Monica came over for dinner. Monica left her bag in the living room while she helped her mother in the kitchen, and Robert, moving with the quiet efficiency of a man who had once deposed 47 witnesses in a single month, slipped the laptop out, inserted a USB drive loaded with forensic imaging software, and cloned the entire hard drive in under 4 minutes. Later that night, alone in his study, he began to read. The laptop contained a folder labeled simply Finances. Inside were spreadsheets tracking the money, where it came from, where it went, and projections for future withdrawals. There was a separate folder labeled Timeline, which contained a month-by-month plan for Monica's cancer journey, complete with scheduled symptom escalations, planned social media posts, and a detailed calendar of when she would need to appear sicker and when she could afford to seem better. There was a folder labeled Personnel, which contained contracts and payment records for the actors she'd hired to play nurses, the freelance graphic designer who had created her fake pathology reports, and the voice actor she'd used to impersonate various doctors on phone calls with David. And there was a folder labeled Exit Strategy. Robert opened the Exit Strategy folder and found a document that made his hands shake. It was a timeline for the final phase of Monica's plan. Within 6 months, she intended to announce that her cancer had metastasized to her brain. She would begin showing symptoms of cognitive decline, confusion, memory loss. She would stage a medical emergency. And then, when David was sufficiently convinced that her condition was terminal, she would disappear. The document detailed a plan to transfer the remaining funds, liquidate the house while David was distracted by grief, and relocate to a non-extradition country under a new identity. Monica had researched the visa requirements for 3 different nations. She had already applied for a passport under a variation of her maiden name. She had booked and then canceled a flight to Panama twice, waiting for the right moment to leave her husband with nothing but a mountain of debt and a story he would never be able to explain. Robert closed the laptop. He sat in the dark of his study for a very long time. The question was no longer whether his daughter was a criminal. The question was how much worse this would get before he could stop it. And the man at the center of the storm, the man who was still making coffee for his wife every morning and kissing her bald head and telling her she was the bravest person he'd ever known, had absolutely no idea that the woman he loved was already packing her escape. Robert knew he had to tell David, but telling David wasn't enough. The money was still moving. The plan was still active. And if Monica caught even a whisper that her father was onto her, she would accelerate the timeline. She would vanish. And David Calloway would be left alone in a house he couldn't afford, mourning a woman who had never existed. So Robert made a decision that only a man with his particular skill set could make. He would not just expose his daughter, he would set a trap. And the bait would be the one thing Monica couldn't resist: more money. He called David the next morning and asked him to meet for lunch, just the two of them. There was something, Robert said, that they needed to discuss about Monica's treatment. Something important. David agreed immediately, because David was a good man who trusted his father-in-law completely. He had no idea that the lunch he was about to attend would dismantle his entire world. And neither did Monica, who was at that very moment sitting in her rented office suite, practicing her confused patient expression in the mirror, preparing for the final act of the most devastating performance her family would ever witness. The lunch happened at a diner off the interstate, the kind of place where the coffee is bottomless and the conversations are supposed to be forgettable. David arrived first, ordered a black coffee, and sat in a booth near the window watching the trucks roll by on the highway. He was tired. That was the thing Robert noticed the moment he walked in. Not just physical exhaustion, but the deep marrow tired of a man who has been carrying a weight so long he's forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. Robert slid into the booth across from him, and for a long moment, neither man spoke. "I need to tell you something," Robert said, "and I need you to listen to every word before you react. Can you do that?" David's face shifted, confusion first, then a flicker of fear. "Is it Monica?" he asked. "Is she worse?" Robert set his briefcase on the table, opened it, and removed a folder, not the full file. He'd left the worst parts at home, but enough. Copies of the forged pathology reports, the document examiner's analysis, photographs of the empty office suite, bank statements with the transfers highlighted in yellow. He laid them out one by one, slowly, the way a surgeon lays out instruments before telling the family that the operation didn't go as planned. David looked at the papers. He looked at Robert. He opened his mouth and closed it. Then he laughed, not a real laugh. The short, sharp exhale of a man whose brain has decided that what he's seeing cannot possibly be true and is offering humor as a temporary life raft. "This is some kind of mistake," David said. "She shaved her head. I shaved her head. I held the clippers." Robert said nothing. He let the silence do the work. He had learned decades ago that when a man is being handed a truth he cannot hold, the best thing you can do is let him drop it and pick it up again himself. It took David approximately 4 minutes to stop shaking. During those 4 minutes, he picked up each document and examined it with the desperate attention of a man looking for the flaw that would make everything okay. He didn't find it. The forgery report was undeniable. The bank statements were his own, provided by his own accountant. The photograph of the empty suite matched the address he had driven Monica to at least 3 times, waiting in the parking lot while she went inside for her treatments. He had never gone in with her. She told him the clinic preferred patients to attend alone, that it preserved the sterile environment, that she'd be fine. "Sweetheart, really, just wait here." He'd sat in his truck and scrolled through his phone while his wife walked into an empty room and spent 2 hours doing absolutely nothing. "Why," David finally said. The word came out cracked, barely more than a whisper. "She's my wife. I love her. Why would she do this?" "That question," Robert told him, "is exactly what we're going to find out. But first, I need you to understand the position we're in. Monica doesn't know I've discovered this. If we confront her now with what we have, she'll run. She has a passport under a fake name. She has a ticket to Panama booked and canceled twice, waiting for the right moment. She has an exit strategy on her laptop that I've already imaged." David stared at him. His mouth hung slightly open, and for the first time since the meeting began, his eyes weren't sad. They were furious. "She was going to leave," David said. "She was going to leave me with nothing and just disappear." Robert nodded. "She still might if we don't do this carefully." The plan Robert laid out across that diner table was not legal in the strictest sense of the word. He'd spent 40 years practicing law, and he knew exactly which lines he was about to cross. But he'd also spent 40 years watching terrible people escape consequences because good people followed rules that terrible people ignored. He was done with that. The trap was simple. David would tell Monica that an old investment had matured unexpectedly, a small utilities fund that his grandfather had set up decades ago and that he'd forgotten about. The payout was significant, roughly $200,000. He'd tell her he wanted to put it toward her treatments, that he'd already spoken to his father-in-law about the best way to transfer the funds without triggering a tax penalty. Robert would then tell Monica, separately, that he'd set up a special medical trust account for her, but that the paperwork required her in-person signature at his bank, on a specific day, at a specific time, in a room where Robert would be waiting with every piece of evidence he'd assembled, and a very particular phone number, the number for the FBI's healthcare fraud division. "She'll walk into that room," Robert said, "and there will be no exit, not Panama, not a fake passport, just her, the evidence, and a choice: cooperate fully or face federal charges." David listened to all of this in stunned silence. "But she's sick," he said. Then he caught himself. "No, she's not sick. She's not sick at all." The realization hit him in real time, and watching it happen, Robert Keene felt something he hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, not vindication. Just the quiet, terrible sadness of watching a good man lose the last piece of his innocence. The bait worked faster than either of them anticipated. When David mentioned the inheritance that evening, Monica's eyes lit up with something that was not gratitude or relief. It was calculation. David saw it for the first time, that flicker of rapid processing behind her smile, the way her mind immediately began rearranging numbers and timelines. She asked all the right questions. How much exactly? When would it clear? Could they accelerate the transfer? She mentioned a new treatment she'd been researching, an experimental protocol in Switzerland that she said could be her last real chance. David agreed to everything. He played his role perfectly, because for the first time in 7 months, he was no longer a victim. He was a participant in his own rescue. But here's where the story takes the turn that nobody saw coming. And I mean nobody, not Robert, not David, not even the federal agents who would later become involved. Because Robert Keene, for all his preparation, had made one critical miscalculation. He had assumed Monica was working alone. 3 days before the scheduled meeting at the bank, Robert received an email. It came from an encrypted address he didn't recognize, and it contained a single PDF attachment. The attachment was a dossier, a thick, meticulously organized dossier on Robert Keene himself. It included photographs of his house, his daily routines, the routes he drove to the grocery store. It included the names and addresses of his 3 grandchildren, David's children from his first marriage, who lived in Ohio. It included a transcript of every phone call Robert had made to Marcus Webb, and it included a note, short, direct, written in a calm that was far more terrifying than any threat. "Stop digging, or we start digging into you." Robert stared at his screen for a full 5 minutes. Monica hadn't been running a solo operation. She had a partner or partners, someone with technical skills, surveillance capability, and a willingness to go to places that even Robert hadn't anticipated. The game had just changed. The stakes had just multiplied. And the woman at the center of it all wasn't just a fraudster. She was the face of something larger, something organized. Something that had been watching Robert before Robert ever started watching them. He forwarded the email to a contact at the FBI, added it to the growing case file, and then sat down to revise the plan. The trap was still on, but now he wasn't just trapping Monica. He was trapping whoever was standing behind her. And he had exactly 72 hours to figure out who that was before they figured out that Robert Keene was not a man who responded well to threats. The lunch had been the beginning. The dossier was the escalation. But what came next, what David discovered hidden in the back of Monica's closet 2 nights before the meeting, would make everything that came before it look like the opening act of a much darker play. He found a second phone, a second laptop, and a second set of forged documents. Not for Monica, for a different name, a different woman, a different cancer. Monica wasn't just running one fraud. She was running multiple. And David Calloway wasn't the only husband who thought his wife was dying. He was just the only one who had a former federal prosecutor for a father-in-law. The trap was about to get very, very crowded. And somewhere out there, in a rented apartment under a name that didn't belong to her, Monica Calloway was preparing to walk through a door she didn't know had already been locked behind her. The second laptop changed everything. David found it buried inside a suitcase that Monica kept in the back of her closet. The kind of suitcase, she said, was full of old maternity clothes she couldn't part with. He'd been searching for anything that might help Robert's case, any additional evidence to hand to the FBI before the meeting at the bank. He wasn't prepared for what he found. The laptop powered on without a password, and the screen opened directly to a desktop cluttered with folders. Folders with names not Monica Calloway, not patients, not treatment centers, other women, 4 of them. Each folder contained the same architecture he'd now come to recognize as Monica's fraud kit. Fake pathology reports, forged doctor signatures, symptom timelines, staged photographs, social media posting calendars, wire transfer records. 4 separate cancer narratives running concurrently with 4 separate victims. Monica hadn't just been stealing from her own family. She'd been running a parallel operation, collecting donations from online supporters who believed they were saving a young mother in Texas, a retired teacher in Oregon, a college student in Florida, a newlywed in Pennsylvania. The total across all 5 frauds, including David, was approaching $800,000. David called Robert immediately. His voice was calm, the kind of calm that sits on top of something much more dangerous. Robert listened, asked him to bring the laptop directly to his house, and then made a phone call to the FBI agent he'd been working with. The agent, a seasoned healthcare fraud investigator named Sarah Okonkwo, listened to the update and told Robert to sit tight. She was calling in additional resources: identity theft, wire fraud, possibly the cybercrime division. Whatever Monica had been doing, it was no longer a single-family tragedy. It was an interstate criminal enterprise, and the email threat Robert had received 3 days earlier wasn't from a partner. It was from Monica herself, using an encrypted service to create the illusion of an accomplice. She'd been playing both sides, trying to intimidate her father into backing off while continuing to run her scams in the background. The hack on Robert's phone calls hadn't come from a professional surveillance team. It came from a spyware app Monica had installed on his phone 6 months earlier during a family dinner. She'd excused herself to use the bathroom, picked up his phone from the kitchen counter, and was back in under 3 minutes. He'd never noticed. The morning of the bank meeting, Robert Keene sat in his study and reviewed the final version of the file. He thought about the day Monica was born, the way she'd grabbed his finger in the delivery room, the way she'd laughed at his terrible jokes throughout her childhood. He thought about the yellow sundress she wore the day she met David. He tried to find the moment, the inflection point, where the daughter he'd raised had become the woman who could shave her head and film herself ringing a bell for a cancer she didn't have. He couldn't find it. Maybe there wasn't one. Maybe the person he thought he knew had never existed, and he'd spent 52 years loving a woman who was, in truth, a collection of performances stitched together by an appetite for money and attention that no amount of love could fill. He closed the file, put on his jacket, and drove to the bank. Monica arrived at 2 o'clock sharp, the same punctuality she'd always shown, the same warm smile. She wore a headscarf, pale blue, the same one from her most famous social media post. She greeted Robert with a hug and thanked him for helping with the trust paperwork. She commented on how good David had been lately, how hopeful they both were about the new treatment in Switzerland. She sat down in the conference room the bank had provided, folded her hands on the polished table, and asked where the forms were. Robert told her they'd be right in, and then he closed the door. 2 FBI agents entered from an adjoining office. Sarah Okonkwo front and center, her badge held at eye level, her expression as neutral as a knife waiting for instructions. Monica's face cycled through 3 distinct expressions in roughly 2 seconds: surprise, calculation, then a fourth that Robert had never seen before, not in 52 years. Nothing. Just flat, still, empty nothing. The mask fell away completely, and what remained was the absence of everything she'd been performing. A hollow place where a person should have been. She didn't cry. She didn't protest. She looked at her father and said, in a voice so matter-of-fact it made the room feel 10 degrees colder, "Well, I guess you caught me." Sarah Okonkwo read Monica her rights. Another agent began inventorying the contents of Monica's purse, which contained 3 burner phones, a thumb drive loaded with encrypted files, and the forged passport under the name Alina Vance, the same name that appeared on the second set of documents David had found. The name of a woman who was supposed to die of pancreatic cancer in 18 months and leave behind a grieving family that didn't exist. The agents walked Monica out of the bank in handcuffs. Robert sat in the conference room long after they left, staring at the chair where his daughter had been sitting, trying to reconcile the woman who'd just been arrested with the little girl who used to fall asleep on his chest during thunderstorms. It was the hardest thing he'd ever done, and he'd once watched his own wife be lowered into the ground. David arrived 20 minutes later, having waited in the parking lot as instructed. He walked into the conference room, saw Robert's face, and didn't ask any questions. The two men sat in silence for a while, the way men do when language is inadequate to the moment. Then David reached across the table and put his hand on Robert's shoulder. "You did the right thing," he said. Robert nodded, but he wasn't sure he believed it. Doing the right thing wasn't supposed to feel like this. Doing the right thing wasn't supposed to leave a 74-year-old man sitting in a bank conference room wondering if he'd ever see his daughter again, and not knowing whether he wanted to. Monica Calloway was indicted on 17 federal charges: wire fraud, money laundering, identity theft, obstruction of justice, and one count of attempted insurance fraud that nearly made David's heart stop when he heard it. A week before her arrest, she had applied for a $500,000 accidental death policy on her husband, with herself as the sole beneficiary. The policy was set to take effect the day after the bank meeting. It was not a coincidence. David wasn't just a mark. He was a liability, and Monica had been planning to liquidate him before she vanished. The realization that he was supposed to die, that the woman who kissed him goodbye every morning had been quietly stacking the paperwork to end his life, sent David into a spiral that took months of therapy to even begin to surface from. Because you can divorce a fraudster. You can sue a scam artist. But how do you file a motion against the person who planned your death like a line item in a budget, and did it while telling you she loved you? The investigation into the other victims took another 6 months. The Texas mother, a woman named Candace, had lost her entire savings and her marriage before she realized her online friend, who she knew as Lisa, was actually Monica using a fake identity. The Oregon teacher had refinanced his house to help pay for Monica's fake treatment. The Florida student had dropped out of college to care for a woman who was never sick. The Pennsylvania newlywed had spent her honeymoon coordinating meal deliveries for a cancer patient who was, at that very moment, sitting in a spa resort in Sedona, charging the stay to a credit card she'd opened in the newlywed's name. The FBI found Monica's detailed financial records. Every dollar was accounted for. Not a single one had gone to medical care. The money had been spent on hotels, flights, clothes, high-end restaurants, and a cryptocurrency account that Monica had been quietly building as her exit fund. She had planned to vanish with nearly $1.5 million. She came within 72 hours of succeeding. Monica's trial lasted 3 weeks. She did not testify. Robert sat in the gallery every single day, not because he wanted to see his daughter convicted, but because he needed to see the truth with his own eyes, unmediated by lawyers and press coverage. He needed to sit in that courtroom and let the evidence wash over him. The stolen bank records, the forged medical files, the testimony of the other victims, the insurance policy on David's life, the video of her ringing a bell for a cancer she'd never had. He needed to feel the full weight of what his daughter had done so that he could finally stop loving someone who had never existed. He wept on the day the verdict was read, sobbing silently into his hands while the courtroom continued around him. He was not the only one. Monica was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. The judge, in her sentencing remarks, noted the extraordinary cruelty of the fraud, the premeditated nature of the scheme across multiple victims, and the chilling fact that Monica had been within days of fleeing the country when she was arrested. She would be 70 by the time she was eligible for parole. David sat in the back row and did not look at her once. David Calloway sold the house in Naperville. He told me this himself, years later, sitting on the porch of a modest cabin he'd bought in southern Michigan, overlooking a lake that froze solid every winter and thawed every spring, like the world was reminding him that things could heal. He'd taken up woodworking, the kind of slow, patient craft that requires your full attention and rewards you with something solid at the end. He'd met someone new, a woman who ran a bookstore in town, and they were taking things slowly, the way you do when you've learned that speed hides truths. He still had the truck. He still had the clippers he'd used to shave Monica's head, though he kept them in a box in the garage, not because he needed the reminder, but because he didn't want to forget that his own capacity for love had been exploited by someone who understood it better than he did. Robert Keene died 2 years after the trial peacefully in his sleep at the age of 76. Before he passed, he told David one thing that he'd never told anyone else. He said that the hardest part wasn't the investigation or the arrest or the trial. It was the fact that even after everything, he still loved his daughter, not the woman she'd become, not the monster she'd revealed herself to be. But the baby in the delivery room, the toddler who'd called him Dada, the teenager who'd refused to go to prom because her date had made fun of someone's shoes. He loved the ghost of the person he'd believed in. And that ghost, he said, was the most painful thing of all, because you can't bury a ghost. You can't grieve someone who never existed. You just have to carry them around like a phantom limb that still aches in the rain. And somewhere in a federal prison in West Virginia, Monica Calloway, inmate number 14279, still maintains that she was a victim too. A victim of circumstances, of unmet needs, of a father who worked too much and a mother who died too young. She has never apologized. Not to the court, not to the other victims, not to David. In her version of the story, she was always the one who was wronged. That, more than anything, is the detail that haunts the people who knew her. Not the fraud, not the forgery, not even the life insurance policy. It's the fact that somewhere in that empty place where her conscience should be, she still believes her own performance. She still rings the bell. She still waits for the applause. And in the silence of her cell, with no audience left to convince, maybe that's the real prison. Not the bars, not the sentence. The silence. The total, absolute silence of a world that has finally stopped believing her. Here's the thing about stories like this. We want to believe they're rare. We want to believe that the person sleeping next to us, the daughter we raised, the wife whose head we shaved in a moment of profound love and fear, could not possibly be constructing a fiction so elaborate that it consumes every dollar, every tear, every whispered prayer. But the Federal Trade Commission recorded nearly 10,000 charitable solicitation fraud cases in a single recent year. That's 10,000 people who gave money to illnesses that didn't exist, to patients who were never sick, to performances that deserved an Oscar and got a prison sentence instead. The fraudsters count on one thing above all else, that good people will not fact-check a cancer diagnosis, that grief and empathy are enough to shut down the rational brain. Monica Calloway knew that. She weaponized it, and she almost got away with it. David Calloway told me once that the hardest lesson he learned wasn't about trust. It was about verification. He said, if someone you love tells you they're dying, you don't want to ask for the lab results. You want to hold them, and that's exactly how they get you. He now advocates quietly, privately, for families to ask the uncomfortable questions, to make the phone call to the doctor themselves, to look at the paperwork before they wire the money. Not because love should be suspicious, but because love should be informed. The 4 other women Monica conned never got their money back, but they did get the truth, and sometimes that's the only thing that lets you sleep at night. Robert Keene spent his final months writing letters to his grandchildren. He never mentioned Monica's name in a single one. He wrote about other things: integrity, attention to detail, the quiet strength of doing what's right when no one is watching. It was the closest he ever came to explaining why he turned in his own daughter. He didn't do it for revenge. He did it because the alternative, letting her disappear and destroy more lives, was not an alternative at all. That's the difference between a man who merely loves his family and a man who protects it. And Monica, she sits in a cell and waits for letters that never come, from a father who is gone and a husband who has rebuilt, and a sisterhood of victims who have moved on. The silence she now endures is not the silence of a world that stopped caring. It's the silence of a world that finally, mercifully, stopped being fooled. If this story stuck with you, if you felt that cold drop in your stomach when Robert opened the second laptop or when David realized what the insurance policy meant, then you understand why we tell these stories. Not to terrify you, to equip you. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Hit subscribe. And remember The next time someone you love tells you the worst news imaginable, love them enough to ask for the paperwork. Because the truth, even when it breaks your heart, will never steal from you. It will only set you free.